Thanks, Julian. So next up we have Joe Gabent, who's going to talk to us about his paper, Happiness Machines.
No. It'll happen.
Okay, thank you. As I was looking over the initial emails and the information that was coming out about this this event today, I realized that my title was the sort of the least descriptive and the most enigmatic, and so I'm going to dispel the mystery now. And there we go. Edward R. Bernays, the father of public relations. Where the title comes from, Happiness Machines, when Herbert Hoover was taking office in 1929, he was having this meeting with a bunch of ad executives. And he basically told them their job was to create, out of American citizens, a bunch of docile happiness machines that would consume to their heart's content, strengthening the economy and satisfying their inner selfish desires in the process, which I don't think has changed much today. Before last year, I'd really never heard of this guy, and yet we all live with his legacy every day. He really transformed the practice of public relations. And I first heard of him in one of Matthew Lazar's courses last year because he was involved in the Committee on Public Relations, or excuse me, the Committee on Public Information, which was essentially a propaganda bureau during World War I, in which a lot of information was put out by this bureau to get public backing for World War I, which was not a very popular thing at the time. So he was involved with this, sort of cut his teeth on propaganda. And he developed a lot of techniques of mass persuasion that we live with today in the form of advertising techniques, in the way corporations try to construct their images, as well as politicians. And the reason that I arrived at this topic is I'm really interested in consumerism. I'm interested in consumerist behaviors and sort of how they're constructed and why people spend their money on things that they do, how people are convinced to spend their money on certain things, whether it's clothing, whether it's cars, whether it's whatever. I mean, why do we buy something? Is it because we need it, or is it because somebody is telling us and convincing us that we actually need it? And this led me to Bernays' role in developing the field of public relations. Before I go any further, I want to read, although I really tried to focus on Bernays and sort of my assignment was in my senior seminar was to describe this man's intellectual development, or lack thereof, is basically what I argue, throughout the course of his life. I tried to sort of contextualize it in a broader context as well. And what I want to do is read the last two sentences of my paper. We live in a society today where morality and ideals are commodities, available for purchase and marketed by forms of propaganda that Bernays helped develop. This might be the most disturbing aspect of Bernays' story, that we may actually be as submissive and susceptible to group influence as he claims us to be, happy to have our values shaped by external institutions such as corporations and governmental bodies. So it's not just consumerist behaviors that are being shaped for us, but some of our core beliefs, and then those core beliefs are being used to sell stuff back to us. So here is Bernays. As you can see, he lived a very long life. He was 104 years old when he died in 1995. I included a quote. In fact, I kicked off my paper with this quote from his book, unsubtly titled Propaganda, which he wrote in 1928, that says, "If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it?" He was very unapologetic about this. He was not ashamed at all about his use of propaganda. In fact, he thought it was necessary for democracy. He thought that it was too dangerous to let people have control over their own lives, and thought that consumerism could be used to give them the illusion of control while actually allowing a responsible elite to maintain control and manage society through a hidden government. Of course, he was part of this hidden government as well. He was a very egotistical guy, and he also liked to think of himself as very progressive. He liked to think of himself as a social scientist, and he called this process the engineering of consent, or crystallizing public opinion, both of which became titles of his subsequent some of his published works. He wrote a lot. He wrote, I think, over 20 books on public relations. And over these publications, he went to a lot of effort to lay out a lot of guidelines about the public relations field, a lot of ethics that they should follow, which he then continued to break. He broke all of his rules all throughout the course of his life. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of his predecessors, because his ideas were not new. There was a guy named Gustave Le Bon who wrote a book called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. He was a French social psychologist, and he sort of the originator of crowd psychology. He wrote that at the time, unconscious actions of crowds were replacing conscious actions of individuals. There was another gentleman named Wilfred Trotter, who was a British physician and sociologist, wrote a book called Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War. He himself was influenced by Le Bon, and he declared gregariousness to be an innate quality of humans, kind of like bees in a hive or birds in a flock, and thought that quality could be used to influence them. And then the daddy of them all in terms of unconscious and subconscious manipulation was Uncle Sigmund Freud. It was his uncle. Bernays was Freud's nephew. In two ways. His father was married to Freud's sister, and his mother, his father was married to Freud's sister, and his mother was Freud's other sister. Did I get that right? In any case, there were two connections to the Freudian legacy, which he tried to carry on. And of course, Freud suggested that a lot of our behaviors were not done out of free will. There was a lot of unconscious or subconscious thought behind them. And Bernays really tried to carry on that intellectual legacy throughout his work. So again, his ideas were not new, but he was sort of the first guy to take them and use them in peacetime to influence public opinion, and mainly in the service of corporations to sell stuff to us. He linked his persuasion campaigns to certain products, convincing us to buy them even though we didn't actually need them. And the reason that the reason that his ideas didn't change that much throughout his life is because world events continued to reinforce them, and also with the growth of the American economy, public relations and the growth of the American economy sort of propped up one another. So I want to talk a little bit about some of his tactics, which you'll recognize. I mean, that's the thing that as I was trying to put together this presentation, I'm looking at some of these ads going, well, this isn't anything new to us because they've been in existence for such a long time. But at the time, they were really new. So one of the things he did is he didn't sell products directly. He didn't talk about the features of a certain product. What he tried to do is remove sales resistance and sell new ways of behaving. So a quick example would be he worked for the publishing house Simon & Schuster. Instead of just trying to sell books, he worked with architects, with designers, with basically to build in bookshelves into their plans. So if I go buy a house that has a bunch of bookshelves, guess what? I have to buy a bunch of books to fill them. So that's sort of a quintessential example of this technique that he used. He would generate news events, and these news events would garner media coverage, which would give attention to whatever product he was selling or company he was working for. Another example, he worked for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York, and when he got married in 1922, he checked his wife in using her maiden name. That was a very uncommon thing to do at the time. So, of course, everybody thought it was such a scandal, and this hotel got a bunch of press coverage. So let's talk about smoking. He worked for the American Tobacco Company, and of course, the tobacco industry, I think, is probably the prime culprit in this type of advertising. And a lot of these, again, will look familiar to you. He had this campaign he called the Torches of Freedom campaign. And when he was working for American Tobacco, he, in true Freudian fashion, he consulted this guy, as a psychoanalyst named A.A. Brill, who said that it will be very easy to get women to smoke. I mean, that was what this whole campaign was about, is to break down the social taboo that existed against women smoking in public. It was thought to be, a very low thing to do, unfeminine, inappropriate for women who had any sort of social standing. So he went to A.A. Brill. A.A. Brill, in true Freudian fashion, said, well, you know what? Women want power. They want independence. And by the way, they have that whole Oedipal complex, and if they smoke, guess what? They have their own phallus. And so that was sort of the Freudian background through smoking. But what he also did is he played on women's insecurities, on their sense of femininity, by selling cigarettes as an appetite suppressant. So as you may be able to see, it says, light a Lucky Strikes, and you'll never miss sweets that make you fat. He also, this ad is actually from the 70s, I believe. This is for Virginia Slims. It says, "You come a long way, baby." Again, playing on this, he had this ability to sort of tap into to social and cultural trends that already existed, but he was able to tap into them. And of course, in the 20s and 30s, feminism was on the rise once again, and so he modeled a lot of his ad campaigns for smoking around that. He also had this tendency to, he had this belief that people want to believe what their leaders and their cultural icons and celebrities tell them. And so he got doctors, in this case, 20,679 physicians, to say that Luckies are less irritating. And by the way, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. Usually these doctors are paid to say these kind of things. I like this one. Some physicians said, smoking is a pleasure, is a good laxative after breakfast. It consoles the lonely. It aids contemplation, and it promotes sociability. A couple other examples that are a little bit more modern. This is Shaq standing next to a big bottle of vitamin water. It says size matters, of course, playing on a certain insecurity that men may have. And also, be like Mike. If you drink Gatorade, guess what? You can be just like your favorite sports star. Another technique he used was to connect certain products to sort of larger movements. In this case, it's not a great picture, but it's an ad for Hoover Vacuum that connects it to the aims of World War II. So again, it has really nothing to do with the product, kind of like this one here, which is Ford saying 2 more reasons why we're reducing Americans' dependence on foreign oil. A cause that we all believe in, of course, and apparently buying a Ford will help you do that. Another thing he did is he worked for politicians, and this is just sort of a random shot. The main one that's of his doing is upper left. He worked for Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge was not a very friendly guy. He was seen as dour and boring, and he basically got a bunch of Hollywood actors, including Al Jolson, to come hang out with him at the White House, and it received a lot of press coverage. And guess what? His approval ratings went up. And here's some other examples throughout history, including our current presidential contest. One other thing which I want to mention really briefly is he got involved, this will be hard to do briefly, but he got involved in the coup of President Arbenz of Guatemala in 1954. He orchestrated this huge propaganda campaign to get people to believe that this guy was a communist. And essentially it was to stop him from claiming a bunch of lands that belonged to the United Fruit Company, whom he worked for, of course. And so he was part of generating all this publicity around this guy, and it ultimately ended in a CIA coup. Just to wrap it up, I want to say that if I was to take this further, because this is obviously a very broad topic, I focused on this one guy, but I could have taken it a lot of different places, and I think I would look further at the development of public relations as a field. There's a couple other guys, a guy named Bruce Barton and another guy named Ivy Lee, who were very crucial in the early development of public relations. Of course, Bernays, being the guy that he was, he lobbied all of his life to sort of become known as the father of public relations. And I think I would look a lot more at psychological aspects, consumer psychology, group psychology, and Le Bon, Trotter, and Freud, and sort of look at their development as well. Thank you.
Is there a few minutes for questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question for you. I found your topic fascinating, certainly part of the American fabric. And my question has 2 parts. How do you think Bernays would view a phenomenon like, say, Hannah Montana? And secondly, did any of his proteges create the concept of the weapons of mass destruction?
I'll answer the second part first. I don't know. The first part, I think he'd be all for Hannah Montana. I think not that I know much about her. Although I know she sells a lot of merchandise and sells a lot of tickets, and I think Bernays would be all for that. I mean, she's certainly, much like many young pop stars, I think portray a certain image that that makes goes after certain desires or thoughts of a person of a certain gender and a certain age. And I think that it's sort of specifically designed to appeal to that type of person, and by doing so allows to sort of bring them into the fold of their product, whether it's their albums, their T-shirts, or ticket sales, whatever. I think he would be, I think he'd be a fan.
Other questions?
I have a question that somebody who had the lead wanted you to ask, so I apologize for reading this. Did you find it, Juliet, I'm sorry, did you find it difficult to blend your views on research as a history major with the task of making a walking tour that would in effect act as PR for historical sites on campus? And this person also wants to know, why are there still cows on campus?
Well, start with the first part. It was a little, well, even just the practice of making the brochure was something I wasn't really used to. I found in doing historical research that a lot of the tasks I needed to do to prepare this brochure I hadn't been trained for. For example, walking through the woods looking for piles of rocks, which I did a lot of. And it was actually quite exciting to map this out. And there was a lot of logistical stuff I wasn't used to, figuring out how long it took to get from one place to another. Editing material to fit in a specific page size, I wasn't really used to that. But in reference to sort of the PR of the campus, I think it would be wonderful if people knew more about the history of this campus. I would be fine with this sort of information being used to attract more students here, because I think if people are attracted by this, that means more people are going to focus on this sort of research, and even of local history. And I think there are so many amazing local resources here in Santa Cruz specifically that more students interested in Santa Cruz's local history would not be a bad thing. And if this is what draws them in, I would be all for that. About the cows, Henry Cowell died in 1903, and his son Harry took over. And I heard one oral history described Henry as the lineman and Harry as the cattleman. So Harry Cowell preferred running the site as a cattle ranch. And I thought maybe that, what you were talking about when I talked about the slaughterhouses, where that was come in, maybe they were selling commercial meat, but I found no evidence of them selling commercial meat. So I think those were usually used as dairy cows, and one was killed a week to feed these workers. So this land was left open, and it was used to have cattle up until it was sold to the university in the 1960s. And I know that the cows come from Davis, I think that's right, that we have a trade-off situation with Davis. They're not here year-round. So they've shown up recently, if you want to go visit them. But to keep that land as agricultural land, we need the cows there part of the time. So they're here now, and you can visit them if you like.
Sorry.
I recently read a book called The Unnatural History of UCSC, and I was wondering, basically, I don't know what to ask. I mean, would you be interested in being a tour guide in terms of having a hike, in terms of a physical hike with a group of students?
Absolutely. I think that's sort of what they're attempting to do at the base of campus with the historical district. Sally Morgan has planned a few guided tours. The problem with the tour I designed, it's quite a bit longer and definitely quite a trek. It takes about 2 hours if you do the whole thing, because unlike the base of campus, which is what lended that area so well to that sort of tours, everything's right next to each other. But this tour is a little harder because everything's so spread apart. I would love to guide a tour. I think it's really interesting to look through these sites. They are quite mysterious. So I hope that people can learn more about them. I hope that doesn't take away the mystery of people knowing about them. But I think having a tour, guided tours of these sites would be fantastic.
I had a question for actually this panel, but also the earlier panel, because now that you've all completed your research projects and you've done, given us a variety of approaches and sources and interpretations, I'm just wondering what kind of advice you might want to offer to potential researchers in the group here or on campus now that you've completed the research. Is there any sort of advice that you'd give them?
Just general advice about how to conduct research. Lazar told me in I saw his presentation on how to be a great writer, I think 3 times, once each quarter that I took with him. And one of the things he said was write now, think later, which I think I've always adhered to is don't wait till you've done days and weeks of research before you start writing. As you start to sort of your ideas start to coalesce, start writing, start putting your thoughts down on the page, and you can always readjust. I mean, especially with a computer and word processor, it's so easy to move stuff around, and if you know it, that'll sort of help you structure the process as you go throughout it.
I'd say also time frame. I mean, I think this works in regard to working with people and with working with text. You need to be able to go back 3, 4, 5, 6, dozens of times, and each time you go back, you get new testimony from the person or the text that you're talking to, and it gets reshaped every time. This specifically happens when I was interviewing with people. The 5th time I talked to them, suddenly all of these gems were released. I'm so grateful to have that 5th time, but I didn't always have that, and so time is definitely necessary.
What I was really grateful with my experience at Santa Cruz was first last year in my junior year undertaking an independent study research paper and then making that into a thesis this year, and I thought that was really valuable. So I would say, if there's other undergraduates or whatever, if there's a topic that you're interested in, go for it. Make it an independent study research paper with the possibilities of turning it into something bigger. Because I really felt invested in my work when it was my research paper or something. It wasn't, I created my syllabus, and of course I'm very indebted to my Professor Westerkamp, my faculty advisor, for guiding me. But you really take control of your research that way, which I liked.
Any of the prior panelists want to weigh in?
I would say that especially in terms of old world historians, but also for new world historians or historians that study migration or immigration, something like that, that an acquisition of a foreign language or multiple foreign languages is most important.
I have one thing to add is to know your limitations in terms of what you can fit into whatever the assignment is. I found that was probably my biggest challenge. My my assignment was limited to 12 to 15 pages, and I went to 17 with really small margins. and I found that was my biggest challenge, and there was a lot of other avenues that I wanted to follow, but I think like Kelly, my biggest issue was staying focused on Bernays. That was my topic, but there was all these other threads that I wanted to follow that I tried to research, I tried to shoehorn in there, and when I realized I couldn't do it, I abandoned them because I felt like it would take the paper off on tangents that I wouldn't be able to fully explain.
We have one more question here.
Well, this is not a question, it's just a general comment, but it's something magic happens, I think, when students do senior essays, and you, in the process of becoming invested in the topic, you actually end up becoming one of the top 4 or 5 people in the world that know something about this subject. and that's really a surprise when you get to that point, right? And it's something to honor, and it's a good reason to do it, because, finding that out, you find out a lot of things about yourself too, such as whether or not you're built for writing or not, because you learn that being your own worst critic is not necessarily a good personality trait. There might be other ways of approaching the subject where you can learn how to be more gentle with yourself, and actually, the thing opens up before you.
On that optimistic note, I think that's great.